Okay, we're going to talk real quick about 550, 440 impellers. I want to try to just give people a chance to see all three of them together and point out some differences so that you can help identify impellers if you're looking at something you want to buy or whatever. And also just kind of talk about how they work. So here we have a 550 SX style impeller. So this one has a fine splined drive shaft that engages into splines in the impeller itself. And then the impeller threads on to the pump shaft. So the drive shaft is turning the impeller, and then the impeller turns the pump shaft. This is the same overall diameter as a JS 550 impeller. Big difference, you can see the SX, the 550 SX style has a much smaller hole and thread than the JS 550 type. And the reason is the JS 550 is installed and operates a little bit differently. It also threads onto the pump shaft, but the difference is it's not driven through splines in the impeller itself. So the drive shaft does not drive the impeller like the SX. The drive shaft goes through and engages the pump. And so the drive shaft is turning the pump and the impeller together. This is an SX drive shaft. The 550 JS drive shaft has a much coarser spline than this. And it's bigger diameter. That's why the hole here is larger, so that big shaft can go all the way through it. And then the 440 actually threads onto the drive shaft, and there is no pump shaft. So I can show you, here's a 440 pump. There's no pump shaft in there, it's just a carrier bearing. And then this is a 440 shaft. The 440 impeller, which is smaller in overall diameter as well than the 550s, threads onto this shaft. As you can see, you eventually bottom it out. And then that inserts into that carrier bearing of the pump. So some of you might notice something a little bit unique about this pump, other than being a 440. You can see the assembly goes together like that. Okay, and then you would pull the pump off, and then you'd have to remove the impeller from the drive shaft, which is a complete pain in the rear. And then the 550, just to illustrate, this is a larger diameter. It does not fit in the 440 pump, neither does the SX 550 impeller. So to compare them all again real quick, you know, if you got a handful of props and you're trying to figure out what's what, the SX is the only one that you see splines in the impeller itself. You know, there's those fine splines there that engage the shaft. That's the only one that has that. It also has the small hole for the pump shaft versus the 440 and 550 are both quite large. The 550 versus the 440, this hole is larger on the 440, and then also the threads on the 440 are kind of at the back. There's not really any threads up in the front of it, whereas the 550 has threads right at the front of it here. So if I take this 550, JS 550 impeller, try to put it on this 440 shaft, it won't go on. It doesn't want to engage the threads, and this 440 slips on. And the reason the threads don't go all the way to the end is you can see this unthreaded area here. So this has to slide on to the point where it's past the threads, right? We start engaging threads in the back of the impeller. And eventually this nose is gonna come up to the shoulder here. So that's the dead giveaway. between those two is the threads on the JS 550 come up to the end. The 440, they're in quite deep. And the SX has splines in it, which none of the others have. Now, one other thing to be aware of when you're looking at props, it's probably not really an issue for anybody really, but an FX1 prop can get thrown in the mix, and you might wind up with an FX1 prop when you didn't want one, or you might wind up with a JS prop when you wanted an FX1. So the JS 550 prop and the FX1 prop here, these are both scat tracks. As you can see, they look very similar. They both have the big nut on them, and the cone's about the same size, right? I think, okay. So the one big difference right off the bat, probably it might not be quite as obvious if you don't have two props in your hands, but this drive shaft for the SX, fits right through this hole, just to illustrate the size. In the FX1, it does not fit through at all. The FX1 hole is smaller. And if I flip them over, you can see the FX1, the shoulder in the back of it is relatively close in relation to the end of the cone. Whereas with the 550 JS, you can tell it's recessed quite a bit. So if you're looking at a JS 550, you're going to see this huge recess. If you're looking at an FX1, you're not going to see that. Okay? And then if you get into a Kawasaki 650 or 750 impeller, they're going to look just like this 550 SX with the splines in them. They go on the same way, but they're going to be larger diameter. So there's no confusion there. So anyway, here are your three 550, 440 type props. And hopefully this helps people out.